So we begin with Comrade David Comissiong. I will be sitting in the chair trying to guide the discussion.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I want to begin by reflecting on just some of the details of the actual terrorist bombing of the Cubana aircraft. The two men who planted the bomb, two Venezuelans by the name of Ricardo Lozano and Freddy Lugo, boarded the Cubana flight in Trinidad, and they boarded the plane with the explosives. The plane flew from Trinidad to Barbados. And somewhere along that journey, or indeed after the plane had landed on the tarmac at Sewell Airport, they planted the two bombs in a rear section of the aircraft. They got off the aircraft and they headed to the Holiday Inn hotel. Soon after arriving at the Holiday Inn hotel, they took a taxi and they headed to the US Embassy in Bridgetown. Then they returned to the Holiday Inn hotel, and later that evening, after embassy closing hours, they returned a second time to the US Embassy. Then they went back again to the Holiday Inn, left that hotel, and went to another hotel on the west coast of Barbados. Of course, by that time, the bombs had exploded in the Cubana airline. The Cubana airline had just left the land territory of Barbados. It attempted to return to Sewell Airport, but it couldn't make it, and it plunged into the waters of the Caribbean Sea, just off the Paynes Bay area in St. James. Now, that bomb could have gone off anywhere. That plane could have, instead of plunging into the waters of the Caribbean Sea, that plane could well have plunged into the Haynesville housing area, could have plunged into Bridgetown. All 73 passengers on board, as we know, were killed. And when we look at this horrific act, we have to say that the people who planned it and carried it out, well, clearly we know that they wanted to destroy the independence of the nation of Cuba. They wanted to bring down the revolutionary government of Cuba. They wanted to destroy Cuba's sovereignty and independence. But they also had no concern for human life. As far as they were concerned, the lives of the 58 or so Cubans on board, including all those young athletes, Cuba's junior fencing team, those lives did not matter. The lives of the 11 Guyanese, including the 6 young students, all scholarship winners, who were headed to Cuba to study medicine, those Guyanese lives didn't matter. The 4 North Koreans, those lives didn't matter either. And as far as they were concerned, Barbadian lives didn't matter either, because it didn't matter to them if that plane crashed into some crowded urban community in Barbados. These Caribbean and third world lives didn't matter. You know, today there's a slogan and there's a movement saying Black Lives Matter. Well, Black lives mattered back then too. Caribbean lives mattered back then too. But Freddie Lugo and Ricardo Lozano were just instruments. They were people at the low level. They answered to people above them. They answered directly to two Cuban-born arch-terrorists, two men who hated the revolutionary government of Cuba, two men who were committed to bringing it down, two men who worked very closely with the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, one of them, Luis Posada Carriles, was actually trained by the CIA. And Luis Posada Carriles, Orlando Bosch, the two masterminds who worked for the CIA, and Ricardo Lozano and Freddie Lugo gave confessions in which they confessed that they were agents for the CIA. The two functionaries were found guilty and they were sentenced to prison, but Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles escaped justice. Luis Posada Carriles was allowed to walk out of the prison in Venezuela and ultimately made his way to the United States of America, where he lives up to today. Orlando Bosch was subjected to an protracted 11-year trial in which all of the evidence was contaminated and was declared not guilty. And he too made his way to the United States of America. So the two intellectual authors were never held to account. But above them was one George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He too was never held to account. He was never brought to justice. In fact, he was rewarded in that he went on to become the President of the United States of America. Brothers and sisters, this was a horrific act of terrorism. It was a horrific act of terrorism that, when we look at the Caribbean, can be fitted into a matrix of centuries of horrific acts of terrorism. Somebody said that we Caribbean people know something about terrorism. Well, we certainly do, because we began our history in this region in terrorism. Right? That's our history. The slave society was a terrorist society. We were the victims of terrorism from the very beginning. We fought against terrorism from the very beginning. And so, yes, if there are any people on the face of this earth that know something about terrorism, that have resisted it, that therefore should have something to say about it to the entire world, it is the Caribbean people. We are very conscious that this Cubana terrorist event was a precedent-setting event. We are very conscious that this event took place a full 25 years before the famous 9/11, September 11th, 2001, when some terrorists flew civilian airliners full of passengers into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Well, a full 25 years before 9/11, it had entered the evil minds of terrorists to use a civilian airliner full of civilian passengers as an instrument of terror. So in a sense, the CIA set a precedent in 1976. They set a precedent that came back to bite them, to bite the United States of America 25 years later. It is ironic, but sometimes that is how fate is. And so we have determined that we need to speak. First of all, we have determined that we need to remember this incident, this terrible terrorist incident, and we need to be in the forefront of calling for Luis Posada Corrales, even now, 40 years later, to be extradited. Venezuela has called for his extradition so that he can be returned to Venezuela to stand trial. The four countries, Barbados, Trinidad, Venezuela, and Cuba, had decided in 1976 that they were to be tried in Venezuela. He walked out of the prison and escaped. Venezuela has said, send him back to us. We still have a trial for him to face. The United States has refused. So it is our responsibility to keep demanding that this man be extradited and be put on trial. Because if we don't do that, if we don't remember this event, if we don't commemorate it, if we don't demand justice, we will be sending a message, first of all, to ourselves, that our lives don't matter, that Caribbean lives don't matter. And we will be sending a similar message to the world. We need to do the opposite. We need to say to the world community, we need to say to the United Nations that we are demanding that the United Nations declare an International Day Against Terrorism, a day on which the entire world will come together to commit itself to totally eradicate terrorism. And we are saying that that day should be the 6th of October. It is important that it be the 6th of October because the 6th of October helps to correct something that Tennyson Joseph spoke about, this idea of double standards. The 6th of October says that terrorism, whether it is committed by ISIS or Boko Haram or some little ragtag terrorist operation, is just as bad and just as evil if it is committed by men and women who sit in suits in air-conditioned offices in the Oval Office in the White House in Washington, D.C., or in London, or in Paris, or wherever else they may be located. And that is the importance of choosing the 6th of October. The 6th of October is sending a message that there are no double standards, that everybody will be held to account, that when we condemn and denounce terrorism, we are condemning and denouncing terrorism in all guises by whoever it is practiced. Indeed, particularly if it is practiced by the powerful nations of this world. I know I have to end. We have appealed to I'm a member of the Caribbean chapter of the network. We have taken up this cause. We have launched this campaign. We made an overture to our Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of the Caribbean, the Honorable Ralph Gonsalves, the People's Prime Minister, and he responded with alacrity. I am not going to say more. I'm going to leave him to say how he responded and how we see the campaign going forward. But as of tonight, there is officially a campaign to have the United Nations declare 6th of October the International Day Against Terrorism. Thank you very much.